I had been trekking through the Black Forest for days, its winding paths and towering trees feeling like old friends. The thick scent of pine, the gentle rustling of branches overhead, and the occasional chatter of birds were comforting, a soothing reminder that nature, in all its wildness, could still be serene. But that serenity was shattered the moment I took a wrong turn. I don't know how it happened. One minute I was on the well-worn path I had planned, the next, I found myself staring at a trail I'd never seen before. It was narrower, almost hidden by thick underbrush, as though it hadn't been used in years. My instincts told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured I could explore this detour for a bit. After all, I was an experienced hiker. I could always find my way back, or so I thought. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. The birds, so lively earlier, had gone completely silent. The wind that had been rustling the treetops stilled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. A suffocating stillness settled over the forest, wrapping itself around me like a thick fog. I stopped to take a sip of water, trying to shake the growing unease that clung to my skin like sweat. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, soft at first, perfectly in sync with mine. I stopped abruptly, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped, too. I turned around, half expecting to see another hiker, maybe someone lost like me. But there was no one. Just trees, their bark twisted and blackened in the fading daylight, as if scorched by some unseen fire. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to paranoia. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding oddly loud in the oppressive silence. No response. The only answer was the dense, soundless air. Shaking my head, I decided I'd had enough of this eerie detour. Time to head back to the main trail. But as I started walking, the footsteps resumed, again matching mine perfectly. Only this time they were closer. I stopped again, and again the sound ceased. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the dense woods, but nothing moved. Not even a hint of life. My pulse quickened, heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was out there, watching, waiting. I quickened my pace, desperate to put some distance between myself and the invisible follower. But the faster I walked, the louder and closer the footsteps became, as if whatever was behind me had grown bolder, more aggressive. Soon it wasn't just following. It was chasing. I broke into a run. Panic surged through me like ice in my veins. I could hear it now, heavy, pounding footfalls gaining on me. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, branches whipping at my face and arms, tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't stop. The footsteps were right behind me, so close that I could almost feel the breath of my pursuer on the back of my neck. Just when I thought I couldn't run any farther, I stumbled into a clearing. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I looked back, expecting to see something, but the edge of the forest was empty. Whatever had been chasing me had stopped at the tree line, as if it couldn't, or wouldn't, step into the open. I sat there, trembling, trying to regain my composure. But then I saw it. In the center of the clearing was a large stone marker. It looked ancient, covered in moss and cracked from age. What drew me in, though, were the names etched into its surface. Dozens of them carved deeply into the stone, weathered but still legible. I walked closer, my legs shaky, eyes scanning the names. They were all familiar, at least. They should have been. I'd read them in news reports over the years. Hikers who had gone missing in the Black Forest, their bodies never found. I recognized every single name, except for one, my own, freshly carved into the stone. My blood ran cold. I backed away, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. How was that possible? My name had been carved there before I had even entered the clearing. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were everywhere, surrounding the clearing, circling me like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. Shadows flitted between the trees at the clearing's edge, just out of sight, but I could feel their eyes on me. Watching, waiting, I ran again. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. My mind was consumed with a single primal thought: escape. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, matching my every move, every breath. By the time I stumbled out of the forest and into the arms of the search party, I was delirious. They found me days later, they said. Days. I didn't believe them. How could it have been days? I'd only been lost for a few hours. At least that's what it felt like. But when they told me what day it was, my blood ran cold again. I had lost 3 days in that forest, 3 days that I couldn't account for. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. How could they? No one would. They chalked it up to dehydration, hallucinations from exposure, the stress of being lost in a dangerous, unfamiliar place. But I knew the truth, and I still do, because every night since I escaped, I hear them, the footsteps. At first they're distant, barely audible, but with each passing night, they grow louder, closer, as if something from the forest followed me back, waiting for the right moment. I don't know how much longer I have, but I can feel it, whatever was in that forest. It's coming for me, and when it finally catches up, I'll become just another name carved into that stone. I've never been one to shy away from the wilderness. Neither has Matt. That's why we decided on a 2-week hiking trip along the Alaskan ridge, far from civilization, where the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant call of wildlife. 50 miles from the nearest town, it was pure isolation, but that was the allure, just 2 friends against the wild. The first few days had been smooth. The weather held, clear skies stretching endlessly above us, and the solitude felt almost luxurious. There was something freeing about being so far from the clutter of modern life. But by the 4th day, something shifted. We found a high point on the ridge to set up camp, a perfect vantage to see miles of rugged terrain stretching out beneath us. It was nearing dusk when I saw it, or rather saw him, a figure, at the far edge of the ridge, standing motionless against the fading light. At first I thought it was a tree trunk, or maybe a rock formation, but when I squinted, the shape was unmistakably human. I nudged Matt and pointed. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked. Matt followed my gaze and frowned. Another hiker? Maybe a hunter. It was possible, though unlikely. We hadn't seen another soul in days. Whoever it was, they were standing perfectly still, facing us, just a shadowed outline against the horizon. Matt waved, but the figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stared, or at least it felt like they were staring. A chill crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. It was probably nothing. Still, as we finished setting up camp and the last light faded into twilight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Matt, ever the pragmatist, told me I was overthinking it. Probably some local. Maybe checking on their traps, he said, sliding into his sleeping bag as the night deepened around us. But even as we ate, talked, and eventually turned in for the night, I found myself glancing back toward the ridge. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching. I woke sometime after midnight, the air colder than it had been when we'd fallen asleep. The fire had died to embers, casting weak, flickering shadows. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me awake, but then I heard it. A soft crunch of shifting rocks. Close, too close, I froze, straining to listen. But everything went silent again. I turned my head slowly toward Matt, still snoring softly beside me. Then, with mounting dread, I glanced toward the ridge where the figure had been. My stomach lurched. The figure was closer now, much closer. It stood at the very edge of our camp, maybe 20 feet away, its silhouette just visible in the dim moonlight, still unmoving, still watching. My throat tightened. I wanted to wake Matt, but my body felt paralyzed. Why wasn't it moving? Why hadn't it made a sound except for the rocks earlier? My thoughts raced, but nothing made sense. No animal stands like that. No human either, not without shifting, moving, making a noise. I closed my eyes, heart hammering in my chest, and told myself it was just exhaustion messing with me. I hadn't slept well in days, and my mind was playing tricks. That had to be it. I forced myself to lie still, listening to the night, praying that when I opened my eyes again, the figure would be gone. It wasn't. When I cracked my eyes open, the figure was still there. But now it was standing directly next to our tent. Its presence loomed over us like a dark mass, featureless, towering, and disturbingly close, too close. I could feel my pulse in my throat, cold sweat prickling my skin. My hand shook as I reached for Matt's shoulder, gripping it hard enough to make him stir. "Matt," I whispered, voice trembling. Wake up, he grunted, barely coherent, but I shook him harder. "There's something outside." He blinked awake, squinting at me in confusion. "What?" I didn't answer, just pointed toward the flap of the tent, where the shadow lingered like a nightmare. Matt's expression changed from groggy irritation to sharp alarm in an instant. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, sitting up slowly. For a moment, we both just sat there, too scared to move, barely breathing as we listened to the night. It was unnervingly silent. The figure remained outside, still unmoving, still watching. "We have to check," Matt finally whispered, his voice low and steady, though I could tell he was just as unnerved as I was. He reached for the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife as he unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peek out. And then, just like that, it was gone. Matt and I exchanged confused, frightened looks. I leaned out, scanning the area where the figure had been. Nothing, only the quiet, cold night and the rustling of trees in the distance. No footsteps, no tracks, no sign anyone had been there at all. "Did you imagine it?" Matt asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "I don't know," I replied shakily. "I swear it was right there." We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, too scared to sleep, too wired to move. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with us, and we drifted into a restless, uneasy slumber. When I woke up at dawn, my first thought was that it had all been a dream. But the moment I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, that illusion was shattered. The ground around our tent was covered in deep footprints, human footprints. They circled our camp in tight loops, over and over, like someone or something had walked around us all night. My breath caught in my throat as Matt emerged from the tent, his face pale. He saw the tracks too, and neither of us needed to say anything. The figure hadn't been a hallucination. It had been real. "Let's pack up," Matt said, his voice tight with fear. "We're leaving now." We tore down camp in record time, our eyes constantly darting to the ridge, half expecting to see the figure reappear. But it didn't. We hiked hard all day, pushing ourselves to get as far from that place as possible. But no matter how much distance we put between us and the ridge, the feeling of being watched never left. We reached the next town 3 days later, exhausted on edge, and haunted by what we had seen. We didn't talk about it much afterward. There was no need. We both knew what we had witnessed, what had followed us, watched us. I thought I could forget it, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again, the sound of rocks shifting, footsteps circling, soft and deliberate. And when I look out my window, I swear I see a figure standing just beyond the trees, still silent and watching, always watching. The Arizona desert can do strange things to your mind, especially after hours of hiking under the relentless sun. The heat distorts the horizon, creating ripples that seem to dance and twist, playing tricks on your eyes. I had always loved the desert for its vastness and isolation, but after what happened on that trail, I can't look at it the same way. Not anymore. It was supposed to be a routine hike, just me and my girlfriend, Sarah, trekking a remote trail we'd found online. The trailhead was practically empty when we arrived, save for a few dried-out shrubs and the occasional lizard darting between rocks. No other cars, no signs of other hikers. It was exactly the kind of solitude we craved. We'd been walking for hours, the sun baking the ground beneath us, when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a child crying. Faint, but clear, carried on the still desert air. We stopped dead in our tracks and exchanged confused glances. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. "Yeah, I did," I replied, scanning the vast, barren landscape. There was nothing out there, just miles of dirt, rocks, and cacti. No families, no other hikers, and certainly no children. Another cry. This time it was louder, more desperate. "Maybe someone's lost," Sarah said, already turning toward the sound. "We should check it out." I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but Sarah had always been the more compassionate one. And before I could protest, she was already moving, her boots crunching over the dry earth. I had no choice but to follow. The crying seemed to drift in and out, like it was being carried by the wind. Every time we thought we were getting closer, it would suddenly seem farther away, just out of reach. We walked for what felt like hours, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert floor. How far could a kid have wandered out here? I muttered, wiping the sweat from my brow. I don't know, but we can't just leave them. Sarah replied, determination in her voice. The further we walked, the stranger it felt. There were no signs of anyone, no footprints, no discarded water bottles, no indication that anyone had been out here. Just that incessant crying, pulling us deeper into the desert. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. We found ourselves standing in front of a dilapidated old cabin, half hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. It was the kind of place you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. The wooden structure was weathered and crumbling, the windows shattered, and the roof sagged like it was on the verge of collapse. Where the hell did this come from? I whispered, more to myself than to Sarah. She didn't answer. She was already stepping toward the cabin, her curiosity overriding any sense of caution. I followed, my stomach twisting with a growing sense of unease. There was something off about this place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We approached the cabin, the air around it cooler than it should have been. Sarah pushed the door open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust coated everything, from the tattered children's clothes scattered across the floor to the old. Broken toys lying in heaps. A small rocking horse sat in one corner, its paint peeling and wood cracked. The air was thick with the smell of decay, as though the place had been abandoned for decades. "Who leaves this out here?" Sarah whispered, crouching down to pick up a tiny faded shirt. "Do you think the child—" Before she could finish her sentence, a noise shattered the eerie silence. The crying louder now. But it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was behind us. We spun around, hearts racing. There was no one there. Just the door, which slammed shut with a violent bang that echoed through the empty cabin. The sound reverberated in my chest, and my blood ran cold. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah gasped, her face pale. I didn't have an answer. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking, and yanked at the handle. It didn't budge. It felt like something was holding it closed from the outside. Panic surged through me, and I clawed at the wood, desperate to get out. The crying grew louder, more insistent, filling the cabin with a bone-chilling wail that made my skin crawl. It felt like it was coming from all around us, seeping through the walls, through the very air itself. I turned to Sarah, her wide eyes mirroring my own terror. "We need to get out of here now," I said, my voice shaking. Together, we threw ourselves at the door, slamming into it with all our strength. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally gave way, and we stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The crying stopped again, leaving behind an oppressive silence. We didn't waste a second. We ran, not caring which direction, just wanting to put as much distance between us and that cursed cabin as possible. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped, our legs trembling and lungs burning. I turned around, expecting to see the cabin in the distance. But it was gone. The spot where it had stood was nothing but open desert. No rocks, no structure, nothing. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. But Sarah saw it too. There was no trace of the cabin at all. "How? How is that possible?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. None of it made any sense. The cabin, the crying, the door that wouldn't open. It was like something out of a nightmare. We didn't talk much on the hike back. The desert was vast and empty, and with every step I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to hear that crying again. But the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the hard-packed dirt. When we finally reached the trailhead, there was still no one else around. No cars, no hikers, nothing to suggest that anyone else had been out there. We got into our car and drove in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging between us like a dark cloud. It's been months since that hike, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed us back. At night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes think I hear it, the faint sound of a child crying, somewhere in the distance, just beyond the edge of hearing. It always starts so quietly that I'm never sure if it's real or if my mind is playing tricks on me. But the worst part is Sarah. She hasn't been the same since that day. She's quieter, withdrawn, as though something inside her broke when we left that cabin behind. Sometimes I catch her staring out the window, her expression distant, her eyes hollow. And then, just last night, she woke me up in the dead of night, shaking me with a frantic look in her eyes. "I heard it again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The crying, it's closer now." I lay awake for hours after that, listening. And though I didn't hear it that night, I know it's only a matter of time. Because whatever was in that cabin, it's not finished with us yet.